En route to burrow.
Something to dig.
Burrow, like Borrough.
Okay. I think burrow like a chipmunk.
Santa Claus is digging a hole.
Merry Christmas and welcome back to Reason Together podcast, the podcast for Christians who think about stuff. And I'm Daniel Fox, your host here with my great friend Thomas Balsamo, and looking forward to today's conversation. How are you, Tom?
Ho, ho, ho. It's
all right.
I'm not feeling the best, so you might hear it in my voice a little bit. I hope it's not too off-putting to our listeners, but there's been something going around here, and
yes,
I kind of got hit with it twice, so I'm doing okay otherwise. If I have to have like a coughing fit here, we might have to edit it out. I don't think our listeners want to hear that, but I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Doing well. Doing very well. Yep. Keeping busy and loving life. And so
good.
Going well. Yes.
Good. Well, maybe you need a good cold right now. That's what you need. Just kind of
rain on that parade.
That's it. So that, because misery loves company, and I need you to have a cold right now. So
hey,
we can sob together.
Yeah. Before we jump into our questions, two things. Number one, I want to thank all of our patrons who have signed up at patreon.com/reason together. Thank you so much for your investment throughout the year and what you give. We don't take that lightly, and how you invest in what we do here and enable us to pay the bills and more. And thank you so much for that. And if you're not a supporter, but you'd like to be, you can go to patreon.com/reason together. Sign up for one of those tier levels there. The elite level gets you a free podcast t-shirt and access to the patron only feed there, or the chats. And so we encourage you to look at that. But even if you're just listening, feel free to give us a 5-star review on iTunes. That would be fantastic. We love feedback. If you've got a thought about what we're talking about, or even something totally unrelated, just something that crosses your mind and you think, I'd like to hear those guys batted around, reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com. That's reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
So whether I just was not paying attention very well just there, or entered a slight coma, I know not, but I didn't catch it. Did you happen to mention the perk of the Aftershow Bonus episode?
Oh, I skipped right over that. No, that's right. If you're an elite patron, you also get the after show, which is a second show every time we record. Not quite as long, maybe a little bit more laid back, another conversation, more content. And so we've got several elite patrons, and just thankful for all of our patrons, all of our listeners, and the feedback that you give. Before we jump into our conversation for today, Tom, and just start picking things off the list, I was wondering, what is there one gift that you would recommend to all of our listeners? You say, if you could buy them something, what would it be?
If I could buy them something?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. If you could buy them something that you would want them to have, or you'd want them to get from someone else.
Boy, there's so many ways I could go with that. I'm wondering if this is like, if you're like doing like a volleyball set here for me to spike in with saying you need to buy a Reason Together t-shirt.
No, actually, that's not what I was doing, but that's a good thought.
Or do you really want, like, what would I buy?
What one piece of fashionable attire would you want our listeners to wear to their Christmas and New Year's gatherings? I'm kidding.
Well, you've narrowed it down now subtly, I might add, to attire.
Yeah, fashionable attire. Actually, that was a total pitch for our podcast t-shirts there. But no, back to the original question. Just like what kind of a gift that you feel like, everybody ought to have one of these?
Oh man, a good study Bible would be one. either print or digital, but something with a sufficient amount of study helps in it to help sort of prompt your thinking and your study as you read through scripture, because you don't have to go far. That's the convenience of a study Bible. You don't have to go far to find good contextual cross references and commentary, because it's often right there.
I'm thinking
that's a convenient thing.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to say is a Leatherman, like a good multi-tool.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Good. Well, that's almost like the same thing in two different spheres. A multi-tool, like a study Bible, sort of like your spiritual multi-tool in a way.
Yeah, sure.
I've heard good things about, I want to say maybe it's the KJV Study Bible. Maybe I think that just might be the name of it. I know it sounds really unoriginal. Maybe I'm not remembering the title correctly. I don't have one, but I've heard good things about it. There's a Life Application Study Bible.
Mm-hmm. I've heard of that one.
Heard of that one. Good things about that one too.
I've heard real good things about that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. I know I asked the question, and I'm not honestly sure how I would answer it exactly. What one thing I would want for people? It'd probably be a book of some sort. But I've been in a few books recently and really enjoying them. But I don't know that I could land on one quite yet. So I don't know. If I think of something, I'll say it later. But
okay.
You've got a number of things on our list. Some may just be fun. Others, a question that we need to bounce around.
Yeah. Well, I assure you, even the fun ones, there is a purpose to them all.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, shoot.
Okay. So, dude, do you...
Sorry.
That's the setup to this conversation, because okay. I was reading, I subscribed to some things by email, and I got this article that I thought was fascinating, and I will try to include it in the show notes.
Okay.
But it has to do with the etymology and the history of the word dude. Are you familiar with this?
I've heard over the years, like, where does that word come from? And I've heard, the preposterous or whatever. And so I guess I've questioned, does anybody, well, actually a son just recently asked me that, one of my sons. And I said, I was maybe kind of shooting from the hip. And I said, I would think might have reference back to maybe a cowboy term or a ranch term, like a dude ranch or something like that. But I don't know. Is there something authoritative out there that tells the etymology?
As with often with etymology, the way it goes is there's nothing super authoritative in every case. You can kind of almost guesstimate sometimes the use of a word and sort of find its public use in print materials from ages ago and see how it was used and what it referenced. And that's sort of how oftentimes etymologists will take a track on where a word comes from, combined with looking at the actual structure of the word and the languages that were used in its day and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And the word dude, believe it or not, it's almost the opposite of the concept that you were bringing up about like a cowboy or someone on a ranch or someone out in the West.
Yes.
The prevailing theory.
Yeah.
The prevailing theory is the opposite. So I believe it could be traced back to a poem written by, if I remember right in the article, the man's name was Robert Sale. And this would have been in the mid to late 1800s. He writes a poem referencing Yankee Doodle Dandy, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And to give you a little more history on this, a Yankee was someone from New England. And strangely, they were kind of the original American rednecks.
Oh, really?
Yeah, many people don't know this, but originally people from New England were kind of country bumpkins. And they were sort of known for their ingenuity in being able to cobble together junk things into something useful and make do with the things they had on hand, what we might today call a redneck fix or a redneck solution.
Mm-hmm.
Though they might not have looked or sounded or talked like the rednecks of today, they were the original rednecks in this sense. They were the country bumpkins.
Hmm.
They weren't the refined hoi polloi. They weren't the metropolitan type people that you would have found in places like New York or Philadelphia or Boston. So the concept in this man's poem was about a Yankee, someone who's a country bumpkin, and attempting to be or pretending to be someone who is more fanciful, more what we might today describe as a hipster, someone more metropolitan than he is. And he would stick a feather in his cap, right, and call it macaroni, according to the Yankee Doodle poem. But and from my understanding of it, is that the macaronis, that was a term for someone who is sort of the culturally elite hoi polloi kind of guy, the fancy young man. So that's why you see a Yankee sticking a feather in his cap, almost wistfully pretending to be a hipster type guy, is a dandy. It's kind of a joke. It's kind of a fanciful thing. So Yankee Doodle Dandy was the concept that I'm describing here of a country bumpkin attempting to be some metropolitan guy.
Okay.
And eventually Robert Sale takes this concept and uses it in his poem, referring to this young metropolitan man as dudeish. Or a dude.
Not
right?
the country bumpkin trying to be him, but the actual metropolitan dandy is the dude. Right-ish, or is dude-ish.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I'm probably missing details from the articles, but I'll link it so you can read it for yourself. But the original concept of dude, according to a few etymologists that have done the work on this, is that it was like a metropolitan, soft-handed kind of, fancy guy. That was a dude.
Mm-hmm.
And as industrialization happened and more people more men began to dress modern, we might say, rather as opposed to being a country bumpkin, dude became synonymous with man. And now, today, dude, the way it's used culturally, refers to just a real manly man, right?
I mean, nowadays, I guess I just feel like it's this, well, actually not nowadays. It's a generation past now, but in my youth, it seemed more like it was the surfer word, dude.
Yeah.
Like it was almost filler.
Yeah.
Like, whoa.
Well, yeah. And that's a good point you bring out, because what it does is it shines some light on the fact that a single word can really change in how it's used over time. And I think it's super interesting to see how it literally meant the opposite of what it connotes now, and everything in between. It's had evolutions in between then and now of how it's been used. And the same day that I read this article, we were doing our family devotions in 1 Samuel. Part of our family devotions is that we read through the Bible together, and we were in 1 Samuel 2 and verse 25. And you can look it up if you wish. The story is there about Eli and his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, which, if you remember the story, they were really rotten guys, Hophni and Phinehas. The things that they did were reprehensible by any measure. And you find in verse 25 of 1 Samuel 2, it says, "If one man sin against another, then the judge shall judge him. But if a man sin against the Lord, who shall entreat for him? Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto the voice of their father, because the Lord would slay them." And the reason why I found it interesting that we read this verse the same day I read this article about the word dude is because there is a word / phrase in this verse that when you read it, it sounds like one thing, but it's actually another, because of the way that words and languages change over time. So like in the last phrase there where it says that they hearkened not unto the voice of their father because the Lord would slay them. In modern English today, that sort of connotes the idea that the Lord is planning here, the Lord is going to at some point here in the future slay them. He would slay them. You know what I mean? It reads like a narrative where the writer is saying the Lord is about to slay these men.
Like a future tense.
Right. But that's actually Old English, right? The word would in Old English meant something different in this use. It's the idea that the Lord desired to slay them. Interestingly, the New King James Version captures that, where it says, I think it uses the word desired. But that is the actual word that's used there. It has to do with a willful desire that the Lord has to slay these men, presumably for what they've done. They were unrepentant, unregenerate, I believe, just reprehensible men. And the Lord set his mind towards slaying these men. It was part of his plan here to deliberately slay these men. So that's why I say that words change over time. And it's not to say that the King James is in error here. It's not to say that it's wrong. It's just that when the King James was translated, that was the way they spoke. And that just isn't the way that people speak now. So you could get the wrong idea from this word would here in verse 25, unless you did a little reading under the surface here to see that this actually means God desired to slay them. Not that he was just going to at some point in the future slay them, but he had a willful desire to. Does that make sense? And I've come across
like a helping verb in modern English, you're saying, but
and I'm trying to I'm trying not to be too complicated with it, but that's the idea, is that this no longer means the same thing. And there's a number of examples like that, that they're not errors. They're just spoken in a way that people don't speak anymore. And if we're not careful, we miss things. All that from the word dude.
I think you're right. And you see that in the New Testament. I can recall that. I'm sure there's actually several instances in the King James translation where once you know that, you see it. If any man willeth to do his will, if any man desires to do his to do his desire, God's desire, you'll see that concept of will and would as a desire, an intent. All right, what else we got?
Well, that actually kind of leads into another question that's on the list.
Okay.
Because in that passage in 1 Samuel, you see God is desirous to slay these men. Like he actually wants to, is what it means there. In some way, you could ask, was God affected by what these men did? Like, did it change something in him, to where he now desired to slay these men? Like, did he not have that desire before? And then they do these horrible things, and now all of a sudden he has a desire to slay them. And I guess the question it brings up is about God's emotions. So the question I have on the list is, are God's emotions anthropomorphisms? And let me explain the question further before we try to delve into it. Because there are some people who believe that any reference to God having an emotion is an anthropomorphism. And if you don't know what an anthropomorphism is, it's just describing something that's not human as if it were human, if I could put it simply.
Right. Yep. Giving attributes, human attributes to something for us to better understand it.
Right. And there are some who believe that any reference to an emotion of God is an anthropomorphism, meaning he didn't actually have an emotion there. It's written in such a way to appear to us that he had an emotion because it's the only way we'll understand it. Now, there are some merits to that argument, though I don't think it's entirely correct. because and their argument really
Can I
comes
pause here
from,
just a second?
yeah,
To explain to our listeners a little bit more if they're confused on the term anthropomorphic. For instance, when we read in Scripture, it says the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the earth, or the arm of the Lord
the
is
arm of the
strong
Lord is
to
strong.
save. His hand does this. Well, God is a spirit, so he technically doesn't have an arm or a hand or
Right.
eyes or nostrils, but they're ways of communicating to us. In a human-like way, or giving him um, the idea of a body, because we relate to that and we understand it, and it puts it in a way that certainly is very right on our level as human beings, so we understand that. And I would say maybe it's distinct from personification, and that it goes beyond making him a person, but giving
Mm-hmm.
it a very human body concept.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would hope that our listeners are familiar too with the idea that God doesn't change, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
The fancy theological term for that is immutability. He's immutable. He cannot be changed. Nothing about him can be changed. And the way that Pastor Dietrich would always say it is that if God could change, that means he could get either better or worse. And if he got better, that means he wasn't good to begin with. And if he got worse, that means he's not good anymore. Which is a great, short, and succinct way of explaining immutability. But the question really has to do with if I can behave in such a way, like, for instance, Hophni and Phineas, if I could behave in such a way that it affects God emotionally to where it changes his emotion from happy to grieving or to angry, right? How does that jive with the concept of immutability? If God is subject, if his emotions are subject to fluctuation based on what men do.
Yeah, good. There's a couple things I think you need to parse out there. And one is that just because God is immutable means his very nature will never change. It doesn't mean that, I think, like, again, in a human way, if I'm walking straight and I suddenly turn right, have I changed direction? Yes. Am I any different? No. It's just the route somewhere. If I am doing one thing and I stop to do another thing, am I changing in my nature? They say, oh, you've changed, something about you has changed. No, I'm just changing my action.
Yeah.
So we do have to detach his actions from his nature, in the sense that I know everything he does is consistent with who he is, but it doesn't mean that he has changed in his nature simply because he does this action here and this action there, and he acts upon his, he's always acting consistent with himself.
Yeah.
So the question is he in any way denying or contradicting himself? That would be a change in God. And then to tie it immediately to emotions, when we say he desired to do something, that might be a little far, though we see it as an emotion. To say, does God respond to things? Meaning, the way he has things designed, if you sin, there is a consequence. Does that mean that somehow his emotions were subject to our actions? No, our actions were subject to his whole design, and we're going to be judged, and his desire is going to be to judge the unrepentant wicked. It doesn't mean there's any change in him at all. In fact, that just confirms really that he's the same, that he's consistent with exactly who he is.
I think it's fairly obvious, I would hope, that immutability taken to its extreme ultimately leaves God frozen in time and space. He can't do or think or anything. He can't move. He can't change anything about how he interacts with mankind. You know what I mean?
It'd be
Oh,
so much less of what he actually is if we said, no, he always has to do this all the time. Well,
well, I guess I think of like ultimate or extreme immutability is almost like wet concrete that sets until it's completely solid. Well, now it can't change at all. It can't do anything. It's almost at an impasse. And I think that's why if you take the immutability of God to its extreme, then he can't have any emotion. right? He can't feel compassion for lost sinners. You know what I mean? He can't get angry at the wicked every day. He can't do anything because that would wreck his immutability, so to speak. So I think the folks who think that God's emotions are purely anthropomorphic, they're taking immutability too far.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
But at the same time, I think there is something to be said for the fact that God is not going to be subject to emotional change. Meaning if he expresses an emotion, either anger at my sin or compassion for my loss or love toward me, if he feels any emotion toward me, it's going to be his deliberate choice to. It's not going to be that he was subject to me in some way. That Hophni and Phinehas single-handedly, right, went out and controlled God.
Right.
And just made his entire day unhappy and just ruined his day. Well, no. That's the idea of open theism, if I'm not mistaken, where God essentially is just always reacting to mankind, never really knows what he's going to do, and then he sinned today. Oh,
so now I have to do this.
That's not accurate. But the opposite extreme of taking immutability too far is deism. I think that effectively God is not affected at all.
Passive and uninvolved.
He's passive and uninvolved. And I think the correct answer is somewhere in the middle, if I'm not mistaken.
With the concept of emotions, a couple things. Number one, is it an anthropomorphism? I would push back against that. Number one, I think anthropomorphism, to me, anyway, it seems to be more concrete bodily references, but your emotions is kind of on a different level. It's I don't know if I'd say it's metaphysical, but it's when we say God has an arm, okay, well, he's a spirit, but to say we have emotions, we have emotions, and therefore to say God has emotions, that's anthropomorphism. Well, or it could be because we're made in the image of God. And so there's a part of us that's like him. Now, where we stray again is by judging God by our perspective of how our emotions affect us. Right. We are overcome by emotion. We are sometimes dominated by emotion. We're swayed by emotion. We're blindsided. So we oftentimes struggle to be in control of our emotions. Well, that's not true of God. God is the perfect balance. He's the perfect example. He is he is perfect in every way. So if he has emotions, they're always perfectly in order, and he's never obviously not in control of himself or anything else. But
we both have emotions, both God and mankind, but we are often blindsided by ours. He is never blindsided by
in
a change in emotion.
In our frail human constitution, we struggle with.
And I believe he deliberately chooses his emotional response because he knows what man is going to do anyway. Whereas we have no such privilege. So we often are caught off guard by incoming emotions. I think we're saying the same thing. But I think, and by the way, to be completely transparent, we're talking about a doctrine that is often known as the impassIbility of God.
Okay, what does that mean, impassIbility?
So the idea of, it's an old word, it's not used anymore. Well, it is, but not very often. The idea of being influenced by passions. That the ancient heathen gods, lowercase g, of the Greek pantheon or the Roman pantheon could suddenly lose their temper at you. Or suddenly they're overcome with affection that leads to lust, and now all of a sudden they're having an illegitimate relationship with some female god, lowercase g. So the heathen gods were subject to passions and mood swings and fluctuations, and people feared them because of this. And there was no stability in pagan religions. But God is not moved by passions.
Yeah, which you have to say about the Greek gods and the whole storyline there is it's so human. You can tell its origin, its source, because it so mirrors our own feelings and our own faults and frailties. You see them in their own gods.
Right.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And all that to say, we have to accept some form of impassibility of God. We have to accept it in some form, because otherwise it makes God too human. It
Well,
makes
of
his
course.
emotions too similar to ours. Because I think there's great calm in the idea of God's impassibility, that I have all of the assurances I need that he's not going to lose his temper at me the next time I sin and remove my salvation. In addition to the whole doctrine of eternal security, I can lump onto that the impassibility of God, that he's not going to be moved so much by my sin that he's going to respond and take away my salvation like some heathen god of old. He's not that way.
And
But instead,
go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, but I think we have to balance the impassibility of God with the clear statements in Scripture that do regard his emotion.
Mhm.
That Jesus was compassionate toward the multitudes, that he was moved when he saw them,
Mhm.
that he was moved when he stood over Israel. He wept at the tomb of Lazarus. All these things were things Jesus did. And you could say, well, that was just his humanity, right? Because he's the
Yeah.
God man. But yet we're told
No.
that he is the express image of God. He's the
Mhm.
reflection of God.
Mhm.
I think that very much mirrors the compassion and emotion of God. So I think the answer is somewhere in between impassibility and passibility.
And that's a very good point that you make about Jesus' humanity being the very example. And of course, it goes down. We state this so many times, but define the terms. When somebody
Yeah,
says, "Do you believe in the impassibility of God?" You say, "Well, what do you mean by that?" If you
right.
define impassibility as God has no emotions, no. Or if you define it as God is not overwhelmed by and controlled by his emotions, yes. It wholly depends on what you're loading that term with. One parting thought on that, just for a study for our listeners, is to look at the Old Testament word repent, being from the word nachem, which actually is connected to the idea of comfort. Believe it or not, we say, "Oh, God repented; He changed His mind. He was gonna do this, and He said, wait a minute, I think I'll change and do this." No, actually, it's not that. It's not like the metanoia
Mhm.
of the New Testament. It's a different concept, and you really kind of have to weave your mind into that, really get to thinking on that, what that means. But be careful how you read that concept of God repenting.
Yeah, that can be a deep well.
All right.
Let's pause for a moment.
Yeah,
I was wondering if you could read something for us
sure.
that one of our listeners, this was unsolicited. I had no idea that James was going to do this. One of our patrons, James McGowan,
Uh-huh.
he used AI or Chat GPT to write a poem about this podcast.
Okay. Well, I'm
Do you
not
want to
read.
read it?
Yeah, sure. I've not read it before, so hopefully I'm smooth enough. I hope Chat GPT puts some nice meter in it. I'm just going to tell you, I'm not one of those poetry guys that can handle the long form, almost like a sentence. I'm like, where's the poetry? I need like a really simple meter that's got a nice lilt to it. I love that kind of poetry. But
Which, side note, while I think of it, did you read my poem that I posted? Did I read that
uh,
on the podcast? Salad doesn't want to be eaten.
no,
I didn't read that on the podcast.
no, not that I remember.
Okay, well,
Grace us.
now we're gonna have to pause. Okay,
Yep.
hold on, James. Your Chat GPT poem is coming. We have more important things to do at the moment. Of course, my voice isn't great, so you'll have to forgive me. But let's see here. I
we
don't. Okay, I
Go ahead.
wrote this poem back in November. My wife went on a trip to Florida with the ladies from the church for a ladies retreat, and my wife always includes something green with most every meal. Like a
Yep.
salad or
Sure.
cucumbers or green beans or whatever, which we of course consume without complaint. We don't really mind it. But if she's not here to add green things, we don't think of it in the same way she does. We don't prioritize it the same way she does.
Yes.
So I was driving home from work and this thought struck me. I was struck with the title first. So it's one of those poems where the title happens first and then you just write it later.
Okay.
The idea that a child is attempting to convince his mother that the salad he's eating is sentient. Yes. And it is making continued efforts to avoid being consumed.
Okay.
So this is salad doesn't want to be eaten. Mother, I know you want me to grow, and I'd much rather avoid a beaten. But what you don't know, and I intend to show, is that salad doesn't want to be eaten. The lettuce sticks to the plate like glue. My fork can't poke it in place. When it finally works, the lettuce jerks and flicks dressing all over my face. Cherry tomatoes. Okay.
I like hearing you laugh, dude. It's great.
Cherry tomatoes are round and bouncy. They'd probably best stay at the store. They make a squeak when I try to fork them, and they dart out across the floor.
That's true.
Red onions can't possibly be safe, and the research is intensive, that when things in nature don't want to be eaten, they try to smell offensive. And not to mention avocados either. They don't want to be eaten, I reckon. They secretly plotted to go from unripe to rotted in just under a second. Cucumbers, peppers, spinach, and carrots, they've developed a secret power. They've concocted a trick where you can eat yourself sick and be hungry in less than an hour. Vegetables have a mind of their own. My logic here can't be beaten. So don't be mistaken. Just replace them with bacon, because salad doesn't want to be eaten.
Nice job, Tom. Yeah, take a bow. Yes. Well done. Oh, that's
Okay.
good. That's good. Have you ever heard, okay, a couple other real quick here. Have you ever heard of haikus?
Don't get me started on haikus.
So if you're a real literature buff and you like this fancy sort of poem, I just pulled up one online that said haikus are easy, but sometimes they don't make sense. Refrigerator. There you go. So there's your haiku for the day.
Yeah, I have no concept in my mind of how a haiku became a structural thing or in some way enjoyable.
It sounds Eastern. I'm going to guess maybe there's a different mindset behind it, but that's no disparaging remark. I'm just saying the term haiku sounds Eastern, and they think differently. So, all right. So, you ready for a Chat GPT?
Yes.
Poem here. Here we go. Reason Together podcast poem. Thank you, James. In a realm of thoughts where minds take flight, two men named Daniel and Tom unite. With microphones poised and ideas aglow, they host a podcast to the world they show. Christians who ponder, who question and seek, find solace and wisdom in their voices unique. What's that mean? Let's dive deep, they say with a knowing smile, explore the unknown, mile after mile. It depends, their refrain, a harmonious tune, as discussions unfold neath the sun and the moon. Mysteries of faith they dissect and discuss, in a world where certainty can sometimes be fuss. Daniel, thoughtful and introspective in thought, Tom, analytical ideas he has sought. Together they journey through topics profound, with it depends as their compass, truth they expound. So if questions arise and beliefs intertwine, seek out these two minds, let their podcast align. For in pondering matters with insight they share, a tapestry of faith and reason is woven with care.
Bravo. Bravo.
Thank you, Chat GPT.
Yep. I think my poem was better.
Yeah.
Thank you, James, for doing that. I don't
came
know out of left field.
I don't know how you had to feed that in, but that was pretty good.
I asked him. I actually emailed him. I said, "What input did you put in there to get it to do that?" And I think he told me, but I can't remember what it was. But I don't know that he remembered fully what he put in there. But
yeah,
that's nice. What it spit out.
Well, great. Wow. that might have to like I don't know. That might have to be framed or something. Okay, let's see. We've got about 5, 6, 7 minutes to wrap this up. Do you have another question you want to hit here?
I suppose this one could be a few minute discussion.
Okay.
And it's kind of along the lines of what we talked about at the outset about words.
Mm-hmm.
You're familiar with Webster's dictionary, of course.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Did you ever wonder where Webster got his definitions from?
Well, no. I mean, did I wonder? Well, maybe I have a little bit. You're talking about his definitions or his examples? His actual definitions?
Yeah, like what the words actually mean. How did he know what they meant? Like, where'd he get it from?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I don't know.
I mean, I have an answer. I'm just curious to see what your answer would be.
I don't know if he studied them out himself, and as far as like essentially formulating the explanations himself, or to what degree he had a reference work behind him.
Yeah. Well, I think that largely, and you could pick up any dictionary and look through it and you'll kind of see this, largely the definitions come from common use. Like we had talked about the word dude,
Mm-hmm.
right? We talked about the word will and would, right? Meaning kind of the same thing. But, you know, I think there's really nowhere else to get definitions from other than a combination of the structure of the word and common use, like how it's actually used in society. And I think that a mistake that is easy to make is thinking that the, prefix, suffix, root structure will always make the word mean the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually not true. And you can see that in not in the English language just only, but in every language, including the biblical languages, that word structure is not like math, where it always means the same thing. Words are used differently over time, and they're sometimes adopted to be used in a completely different way. And the way that definitions are often discerned is looking at how they're most commonly used. And isn't that how we do our Bible study? When we look up a word in the original language, one of the first things we do is we look and see all the different places that it's used and how it's used there. And that is how we sort of derive what the word actually means. And sometimes the usage of the word actually trumps the root of the word. And I'm trying to remember an example off the top of my head. I can't. But I guess all that to say, there are fallacies of interpretation in which just looking at the root of the word, we think, oh, well, the word has always meant that and it always will mean that. And it could lead us to the wrong conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
We have to look at how the word was actually being used when it was used.
Yeah, I kind of I think there's going to be a hybrid to some degree with Bible study, is to realize that a lot of times the evolution of the word was that, but it's had an origin. So even the common usage has a connection to, in some way, that origin of use. And so,
well, sure.
I've seen the illustration of dust before. Small particulate, matter we call dust. We dust the shelves, and then something else, like if I would say that my friend in high school was so good at the piano, but that by his senior year he dusted me, meaning he blew me away, right?
Right.
And I've seen the illustration, and I don't remember all the details of it, but the idea that, okay, here's like 4 or 5 different uses of the word dust, but they all have this in common. Okay, well, that's where the root concept, that's sort of the root or the stem from which these various flowers grew, because one took this root idea and eventually expressed it in this social context. One took it over here in this context and developed it in this way. And so it's still helpful for me to look at the actual etymology
Yeah.
of the word and say how it broke down. What originally the concept was this. And then I can see, oh, wow, that's really neat. This is the concept that underpins the way that it was used in the passage. And I think people need
Yeah.
to be, and that's just, I caution, if I could put it this way, younger Bible students, and I'm not just talking about Bible college students, but just people who want to dig into Scripture, to say, now just be careful when you look into Strong's and you look up, oh, this word, what's the definition of this word? Well, they'll choose as the definition, like you say, the 15 uses of the word throughout Scripture, and it's all these different things. And then you might think, oh, well, I could pick one out. Oh, that one will really preach, or that one. I like this definition, so I'll stick it in the passage because that's one that Strong's gave. Well, what Strong's is doing is
Be
telling you that,
careful.
yeah, Strong's is telling you the different ways that it was used. My advice to them is to say, now stop and look over all of those usages and say, what's the common denominator? How are they related? What central concept
Yeah.
connects them to give you an idea of the base or root idea of the word?
Right. And I agree 100% with what you're saying there. But I think what I'm pointing out is slightly different, where someone will look at the common use of a word and they'll see how it's commonly used. They'll find the common denominator, but they will ignore that and instead look at the root of the word, and they'll force the meaning of the root of the word onto the interpretation of it in every sense. In fact, this has become common enough that it has become known, at least in Old Testament study, as the Hebrew root fallacy, where you force the meaning of the word onto it by deriving where the root originally came from and assuming that, like math, the root has never changed. But that's just not how language works. You have to look at how the word is used over and over again to derive what its meaning is. Anyway,
that's interesting. I would want to do some study on that, because I wonder if just wondering by the title of the fallacy, if it's ever taken too far, trying to say, that it's disconnected now from its root. And I would kind of push back against that, to say that at some point it can mean something totally different than what it originally meant. Well, it may seem like it may seem like it's gone far afield, but it's still connected in some way.
Well, yeah, sure. There'll always be a relationship, kind of like how we trace the word dude through multiple iterations in English to a completely different meaning that it had originally. It is possible, and you have to acknowledge that it's possible. Not that it's always going to happen, but it is possible for a word to completely flip in its meaning and usage over time because of how language changes. So you can trace the original roots of words back. You can see the connection. The etymologists do this. They'll see the connection of a word and find out how it became what it is. But that doesn't discount the fact that it can happen that a word can mean completely different things than it used to mean, like the English word let, right? For example, that we find in the New Testament didn't mean the same thing 400 years ago that it means now. In fact, it meant opposite things. The same thing can happen in other languages as well, and we have to acknowledge that it does happen. So I don't think that anyone who asserts, not to my knowledge, anyone who asserts that the Hebrew root fallacy exists and happens, they're not saying that there's never a connection between the word today and what the root originally was. There is a connection. It's just they're acknowledging that language can change over time. And those who don't acknowledge that are guilty of a fallacy known as the Hebrew root fallacy. But anyway, I don't want to get too far afield in that. I just thought it was interesting because when you think about it, where did Webster get his definitions from? Well, largely from looking at the structure of words, plus how they were used when they were spoken. And that's still how people get definitions today.
Interesting. So yeah, and then probably one thing, and maybe this kind of ties in with what you're saying, how it's used is also the, and maybe I'm using this word wrong, the etymology of it. So it's like, here was the original word, and then in French it was this, and then in Latin it was this, and then in English it was this, and sort of tracing it through languages, since obviously languages are borrowed. We have a lot of, words with Latin or Greek or since America, especially the melting pot, has a lot of
Yeah.
words that are really borrowed from another language. What did they mean there? That's interesting. Etymology is fun.
Yeah, it is. And I wonder if our listeners would maybe want to do some homework too. And if you can think of examples of words, not just in English, but in any language or biblical languages, even words that now are used in a different way today than they were when they were originally used, and see if you can trace the relationship between them. If you come up with any examples, email them to us at reasontogetherpodcast@gmail.com.
All right. I'm afraid we're going to have to transition into the after show at this point. But thank you again for joining us. And we hope that you have a relaxing and refreshing holiday time now. And I say this because maybe if Christmas is just past and you're listening, but you're looking forward to maybe another day off at New Year's, which why they call that a holiday, honestly, I don't know, it's just a cover. But anyway, hopefully during this vacation time, you have a good time of refreshing and a good time with your family. The Lord bless you. And thanks again for listening. We're encouraging balance, developing perspective, and connecting faith to practice. This is Reason Together.